So it makes perfect sense. I'd never really thought about it because it's those introductions that you talked about that feel like a whole CV. I've always hated those, and so I tried to make it a lot less like it, but it's become a little bit too much less like it. There's nothing in it for the guest to understand.
Welcome to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. I started my first podcast in 2019 and it now has over 60,000 downloads and is in the top 10% of podcasts worldwide. Since then, I took my hobby and made it into a full-time business and now work with over 30 podcasters around the world who are listened to by millions of people. And I help them make the best podcast that they can. I've been excited to work with podcasters from Australia and New Zealand to the Netherlands, the UK, and the US. Recently, I came across an episode of the Better Business, Better Life podcast where an old friend was being interviewed. And so I reached out to the host to connect with her and talk about her podcast. Thankfully, she responded to me and we got chatting. And she has been brave enough to be a guest on Smarter Podcasting for a podcast audit, which means that she shared her episode with me to listen to. And in this episode, I'm going to give my guest and you actionable tips to help improve the audio quality of your podcast that you can use immediately. So my guest today is a professional EOS implementer and is passionate about entrepreneurs living their best life. Because life is too short, right? She has a management and leadership career spanning over 25 years and now uses that experience along with her qualifications in leadership, business administration, and EOS to help entrepreneurial business owners lead their best lives. My guest today is Debra Chantry-Taylor. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you very much. You got me very nervous right now, but I'm looking forward to it.
Nervous? Why?
Oh, I know there's a lot of things I could probably improve upon, but it's not always wonderful to hear that stuff being fed back to you. But yeah.
There's always more we can all do. And I think I'm one of those people that do what I say, not what I do. So I'll probably give you lots of advice and I give advice to people all the time. And then I think about my own podcast and I'm like, do I do that myself? Maybe not. So don't take it too harshly at all. And none of it's harsh at all. So before we get started, tell me about your podcast.
So I think I started my podcast, I'm not sure it was 2 or 3 years ago now, and really it was just one of those silly ideas that like, oh, look, we should do a podcast because other people are doing podcasts. And at the time, I was trying to reposition myself from being known very well in New Zealand as a startup business coach to being somebody who worked with larger businesses and was doing work with larger businesses. And so I thought, a podcast could be a good way to build that credibility. And that's how it started. And then as time went on, I realized I quite enjoyed it. I realized I learned a lot from doing the podcast myself. And now I really do it because I love sharing the stories of the people that I talk to. But I also find that I enjoy doing the actual podcast and meeting some amazing people from all around the world.
I love what you said there about building, was it brand authority or leadership? Because for me, that's the biggest bonus of a podcast. And when I advise people about starting a podcast, especially to support their business, is doing that. And it's to the point now where podcasting is so well regarded that I don't know if you've heard about the V-Shred guy who basically faked being on Joe Rogan to build credibility for his program. So he does like a kind of like a fitness thing. He's all over YouTube and Reels and things like sponsored posts. And I had seen his reel, like an advertisement, and he had the red curtain in the background. He had I think it was the Shure microphone, and he's talking at this angle, and he's talking authoritatively about his program. And you immediately just think, oh, he's on Joe Rogan. Wow. Oh, he's been on the Joe Rogan podcast. That's cool. Then I found out shortly after that he was never on the Joe Rogan podcast. He never said he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, but he did happen to have the exact same microphone that Joe Rogan uses, the exact same curtain, and the exact same setup, so that when you watch it, you think, oh, he's been on Joe Rogan. And so people understand that being on a podcast builds your credibility, builds your authority in your niche. So having your own podcast is a great way to do that. So that's great to hear. So I start every one of these audits with the same questions, just a little bit about your podcast. And the first question is, what equipment do you use to record?
So this is where I'm probably going to have my first kind of negative point, if you like. I am currently sitting in my podcast studio. So when I'm working in here, I have got these microphones, which are, I don't know what they're called, RE20s. There you go. I've got RE20s that actually do the recording. And then I've got some Sony digital cameras that are then fed through some devices that make it go from, sort of to digital, basically. And then these microphones go through an SSL2 Plus box, which I have no idea what that does, but they go through there and they come into my laptop, and then I use my laptop to actually record. And if I've got a guest in the studio, and I've got some key lights, some control, I don't know what they're called, but they're key lights, Elgato key lights, I think they are. That's my podcast studio with a little bit of foam in the background to try and minimise some of the sound bouncing around.
And I saw you have Bose headphones as well, which is, so you've got like a really, really good setup. You can obviously, I can hear it right away that your audio is amazing, because of course, why would it not be? Which is always really good to hear. One of the biggest things when I'm talking with people is maybe they don't have the right microphone, or they don't have it. Like I was working with someone recently, their microphone was like way over to the side and wondering why their audio quality wasn't very good. And I was like, just move your microphone in front of you. So that's all great.
But the reason I'm going to lose points is because even though I have this amazing setup in here, sometimes I get a bit lazy and I think, I'll just record it from my office upstairs, where I do still have, I think I've got, is it a Blue Yeti? No, it's still a reasonably good microphone, and it's on a stand like this, and I've still got a reasonable camera and whatnot. So that one's not too bad. But then sometimes I can't even bother to leave home, and so I do it from home. And then I've got a smaller microphone and less equipment, and so the dog will bark. And so it really depends on what I'm feeling like and where I record from. So generally in here, I think I'm well set up. The rest of the time, it can be pretty average.
I love how for the audit, you're in the best place right now. You're in the studio. I'm sure that's not by coincidence. My next question is, so how do you edit your podcast?
So I've actually had a guy over in India who has been editing it for me. I've got to be honest, I am not technical. Well, I am technically minded, but I don't want to be technically minded. I don't want to be involved with anything other than really setting up the guests, talking to the guests, and I just pass it off to somebody else. And they don't do much from what I understand. I think that they just check the sound. They don't do any editing. They just do the sound checks to make sure the sound is the best it can possibly be.
And that's great. That's why my business exists, to help people like yourself who don't want to be involved, don't have the time, and editing can be very frustrating. So we come in and we can take that off people. So no, that's great. And I think it's one of the things that holds a lot of people back from podcasting, or leads to people stopping podcasting, because the editing part takes so long and can be so frustrating. And so I think it's great if you're already outsourcing that.
Yep.
Now let's get into your podcast. What is your podcast niche?
The podcast niche was designed to be mid-sized business owners who are perhaps feeling like they've hit the ceiling, they're stuck in their business, they might be having some frustrations, and they want to break through that, and they want to listen to people. The reason I started it was because we hear all these beautiful success stories. I'm all for celebrating success, but I wanted people to know that actually the journey to success is sometimes a wee bit bumpy. And so I wanted real people to come on who are successful but can share some of the ups and the downs that they've had in that business. So that was who it was aimed at: mid-sized private business owners, hit the ceiling, want a little bit of motivation, but also want some reassurance that they are experiencing things that are pretty normal for a business. In terms of the actual listenership, if that's what you call it, it tends to be males, 45 to 65, and that's about all I can tell you.
No, that's great. And it's good that you have a defined niche as well, because it's something that you have to do. You know, I think of any successful podcast, they have a very specific niche, and you know, the main advice you read it time and time again is the nichier the better. The more you can have a very specific niche, that's great. And it's like my example I use is there's a podcast called Aged Like Milk, which I quite like, where it's a movie review podcast. And so I guess their niche is, instead of just reviewing movies, they look at an old movie and then has it aged like milk. So they look at it through the lens of the 2020s, basically. And it's quite interesting. Some of those old movies that you love, like Trading Places, or go back to the 80s. I mean, they do a whole range, not just the 80s, up to the 2010s, and really look at it like, you know, is it offensive? Is it racist? Is it misogynistic? And quite often, a lot of misogyny, a lot of casual racism. And so it's really interesting to look at it through that lens. So my point is, I love that they've got a niche, though. It's not just a movie review podcast. Each episode is the exact same and they're looking at it in the same. So it's great that you have a niche. But my next question can be a little bit challenging. what makes your podcast different to every other podcast in your niche?
And that is where I have absolutely no idea. I would love to say that maybe it's the guests that I got on board. I've been very privileged to have some great overseas guests and things. But in all honesty, it isn't something I put a great deal of thought into. I just started this thing just as a bit of a, oh, that sounds like fun, let's give that a go. And we're here 2.5, 3 years later, and I honestly don't know.
No, and I mean, it's okay to not know. And I think after 2 or 3 years, that's fine as well. It might just be something for going forward. You just maybe start to have a think about like what makes me stand out, or what can I do to stand out from the other podcasts. So if it is the guests, how do you elevate the guests even more in your promotion and the titling and the artwork, all of those kind of things. So what is the goal of your podcast?
Yeah, I was going to say, if I might just refresh on that. I mean, in terms of, it is interesting that I do keep track of which episodes do well and which episodes don't do well. And obviously I'm an EOS implementer. That's what I do in my day-to-day job. It is all the episodes that are about EOS that generally are just myself or somebody talking about EOS that tend to do better than any of the other episodes. So maybe that's a little bit of an indication about, what really is makes it stand out.
That makes so much sense, and that feeds back into your niche is yourself, as your EOS implementer. Just tell our listeners, what is an EOS implementer, just in one sentence, and what does EOS stand for?
Yeah, so EOS stands for the Entrepreneurial Operating System, and in a simple sentence, it is an operating system that helps you manage all your people so that they're all on the same page in terms of vision, they're getting traction in terms of delivering day to day, and they have a healthy environment that they work in.
Perfect. So that makes perfect sense that your most successful episodes are guests who are also EOS implementers, and you are one as well. I would say then that is your niche. You could be even nichier. You're not just a business podcast, you're an EOS podcast. And if you've already got data to back that up, that your most popular podcasts are with EOS guests and talking about that system, I don't like to tell you exactly what to do, but maybe my advice would be to think about niching down even more, and that could be changing the title or even just adding to the title. So one of the best pieces of advice that I've learned over the last couple of years is you don't actually need to change the name of your podcast. It could be Better Business, Better Life, EOS implementer or EOS facilitator, something like that, just having EOS in the title. Because we did talk about it last week. You messaged me about your podcast showing up on the directories. And to be honest, it is different for everybody, because when I type in your podcast name, it comes up number 1 because I've subscribed to it already. So it's for everyone, they're going to see it maybe in a different ranking. For me, it was the top podcast. As soon as I typed in Better Business, it came up number 1. But when you are thinking about people trying to find your podcast, and if your niche is EOS, you want somebody who types in EOS, that your podcast is going to come up. And right now that might not happen. Or they're scrolling through all these business podcasts, and there'll be hundreds and thousands of them. And then they see that tagline, the EOS facilitator or EOS advice, whatever it is. And immediately they're going to stop and go, this is the podcast for me. Because that's another thing I've learned over the years. I think about my own podcasting habits mostly, and my wife's as well. We've talked about it, and my friends. How do you find podcasts is when you're just scrolling through either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you find one, you're like, that name connects with me. That's what I'm looking for. And that might be different. One day I might be looking for a comedy podcast. One day I'm looking for a sports podcast. Another day I'm looking for a business podcast. It depends what I'm doing that right there and then, or what I'm looking for. And then you're just going to scroll the app, and then you're going to see a name or an artwork that resonates with you. You're going to stop. Then you're going to scroll through the names of the episodes, and you're going to find an episode that, again, resonates with you. Because I used to always think people only listen to the latest episode. And then I realized, I don't listen to podcasts like that. I scroll through it and find one as well. And the other biggest way that people find podcasts is through word of mouth. So it's going to be somebody telling somebody. And I'm sure you've had friends that do that. I do that to friends all the time. Even I'm actually listening to a podcast right now about Adolf Hitler, because I don't know anything about World War I history. And so it's about the rise of Adolf Hitler. And I was like, I want to listen to a history podcast. That seems super interesting. And again, so I talked to my friend, and I'm like, hey, I'm listening to a podcast about Adolf Hitler. I share it with them. I share it with my wife. So that's still the number one way. And if your niche is EOS, that's what you want, is people in that EOS kind of space to be sharing that with each other.
Great. Noted.
And this might be a bit of a duplicate of the question, but why should someone listen to your podcast?
I'd like to think that it's because I tend to run the podcast like I would talk to people in real life. It's not really forced, it's very much a conversation. I know that I enjoy asking questions. I'm a curious child, and so for me, I really genuinely am interested, and I hopefully ask the questions that they might ask the guest if they actually had a chance to get in front of them. So I would like to think it's just that sort of curiosity and that natural style as opposed to a very forced, manufactured kind of podcast.
And last question, what lessons or values do you want the listener to come away with at the end of an episode?
Yeah, this is where I have my 3 top tips. I want them to walk away with some pragmatic advice and some tips and some tools. And so they've got the story, they've heard the ups and the downs, they've had some advice from a person, but I want them to walk away with something they can actually go and do in their business so that it's not just, oh, that was nice to listen to, but actually I can do something with it.
Nice, perfect. So I'm just going to bring up the episode that I listened to right now. So if I type in Better Business, Better Life, it's going to come up, hopefully. Yep, it's the first one. And so I love the artwork. It's simple. This is, I think some people overcomplicate artwork. They have too many images and all of this stuff. And you can't actually really see what it is. But as soon as I bring it up, you can see the name of it is right there, which is perfect. The only tiny tip I'd give about the main artwork is it says, live your ideal entrepreneurial life is in red, and it's a little bit difficult to see. I think the thing that most people forget is that about 80% of podcast listeners listen on a phone. And if you think about how small a phone screen is and then how small that artwork is, you really can't see much. So that's why the Better Business, Better Life, it's in white font on a dark background. That stands out right away. You can see it. The text underneath, and then underneath again, it says subscribe to receive weekly episodes. It's a great call to action, but it's just on a phone where most people are looking. People are probably not going to see it. So I think you could even just get rid of the live your ideal life and get the bit at the bottom and even make Better Business, Better Life even bigger. You could add an image, or one of the best things is people love people and people like to see people. So a picture of yourself on there help build that brand authority. Big smiling picture of yourself right on the front, Better Business, Better Life. So again, when people are just thinking people scrolling their phone, they're going to see your big smiling face, they're going to see the title, and then immediately jump on there. And I'm just looking, you do have a tagline actually. You have helping you live your ideal entrepreneurial life with EOS and experts. So that's actually awesome. Going back to what we were just talking about, I'd maybe move that EOS right to the front of that sentence. So Better Business, Better Life, colon or dash with EOS and experts. So right away because when you have a long tagline like that, it's going to get cut off most of the time when you're scrolling. And so you just want to make sure that that's right up the front. So let's get into the episode now. So my main expertise, which I hate to use that phrase expertise because you sound like you're such an arrogant twat, but I guess I've realized over the years what my expertise, what I try to share on is the audio quality. And like I mentioned right at the beginning, it's one of those things, do what I say, not what I do. So you could go back through all my episodes and probably like, you don't do this, and that's fine. I probably don't do everything. But again, these are just kind of the best practice tips that when I was listening through to it. So I listened through to it yesterday. We had a power cut here in my apartment. So I went across to the coffee shop and I started listening on my phone. And then there was a power cut in the coffee shop as well. But I still managed to listen and watch on my phone and take notes at the same time. So first of all, I love that you have the video on Spotify. So this is something that's actually quite new to me. And I think you might be the first podcast I've come across. So explain a little bit, how do you get video on Spotify as well? Because it's really cool that you can either listen or watch on the same platform.
Sure. So we use Spotify for podcasters to actually host the podcast. When you upload an episode into Spotify, you can choose to do a video episode. So we record on Riverside, which records either the two of us in the studio or the two of us wherever we are. And then when you upload it, you actually upload the MP4 to the Spotify for podcasters, and then it does whatever it does with it. Again, I don't do it, but that's what my understanding of it. So it's the fact that we actually do full video and we upload that video episode.
Yeah, I loved it. Do you know, is it still available on Apple Podcasts and every other directory, or does it have to be exclusive on Spotify?
No, it's not exclusive on Spotify. It's on a huge range of different podcast things. It's just that I'm not sure you'll see the video on there. But we also use Podpage as the host for all of the design features, if you like, around the podcast. And so on there, it actually puts the video link as well, and you can see it on YouTube.
I love it. So what is the number one method for you of delivery? Is it video or audio?
Well, I didn't imagine, see, I don't listen to that many podcasts because I don't have much time in the car, and I never watch anything on video because I get bored very easily. And so I was really, really surprised when I looked at the analytics. On Spotify, it's almost always people watching the videos rather than just listening to the actual audio. But I don't know if that's a delivery mechanism. I don't know if that just means Spotify plays you the video regardless whether you want to see it or not. I don't see Apple having that functionality. So, and yet most of my listeners, according to the statistics, are actually on Apple. So on that basis, more people on Spotify watch it on video, but we have a whole bunch more people who actually listen to it on Apple.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's hard to decipher because I think the video maybe does play automatically on Spotify. And so it might be recorded as a video, but maybe people aren't actually watching it on video. When I was going through it, I jumped back and forth between video and audio. So I have no idea. I probably messed up all your statistics by jumping back and forth because at some point I wanted to watch it and then at other points I wanted to listen to it. Apple Podcast doesn't offer video yet, and I haven't heard anything about that changing. And there's an ongoing debate, and I'm part of it, between audio and video, and whether video is a podcast or audio. And some people, and I used to be like this, like a podcast is audio only, and if it's a video, it's not a podcast. I've mellowed over the last couple of years to soften my stance. I do believe it does frustrate me when they only have a video and they call that a podcast. If you have audio, like you have an audio and a video, that's a podcast, so that's great. The reason I was asking is just because I think it gets confusing whether you're making an audio for someone to listen to or you're making a video for someone to watch. And I'm doing it right now. We're doing a video recording, but I'm going to put this out as audio and as video. And so it's hard to kind of mesh the two. So that's why I was asking, what's your primary goal?
I must admit that I have watched a couple of snippets of them to kind of see, what they're doing with them. And I can't imagine why anybody would sit there and watch 30 or 40 minutes of me stuck here in a studio doing nothing. And my guest, actually Dr. Vanessa, was actually out somewhere, but that probably made it worse. But there's nothing to watch apart from potentially facial expressions. And I'm not a video person. So for me, it's really hard. I have to go, Debra, you're not the target audience. You have to allow whatever people want.
I think that's such a great point, and one I've not really thought about in such a coherent way. But yeah, like who wants to sit and watch just two people having a conversation? And this is not one of those things where, people don't have attention spans these days. We need 10-second clips. It's not that. I mean, forever, whenever you watch television or a movie, there's action, there's movement, there's talking, there's people. So I've never really thought about that. Yeah, what is the appeal of just watching? I've never just sat and watched two people having a conversation. And anything you do watch, which is really professionally produced, it's going to have multiple camera angles. It's going to switch. So yeah, it's a good point. And I think as well with video, which is really difficult, especially with the way YouTube works, they really want these days like 4K. It needs to be the best cameras. It does need to be quick cuts. And so it is something that podcasters and myself need to think about. And that's why I don't really invest too much time into video, because it's one of those things. So if you listen to Stephen Bartlett from The Diary of a CEO, and when he started his podcast, because he already had money, he literally was like, we're going to put everything into this. And I remember listening to him talk about it, and he talked to his producer and he's like, right, what's the budget for this? And he came back with like £20,000, for example. I can't remember the exact figures, and told him what that was going to buy. And then he's like, let's make it 50,000 and get the best, so in his studio, they have moving cameras on rails. They have the best equipment. And you look at that and it's one of the biggest podcasts in the world. That's why, because it has this huge budget. And then there's all these independent podcasters like me and you wondering why our podcast isn't huge. And because we don't have the best equipment, the best editors, these quick cuts, the best angles. And so it is difficult to get traction on video.
As I say, I think the reason that we started doing it, we did it right from the beginning. So I guess the reason was more from, I'm a marketer by trade. And so I kind of went, oh my gosh, if we're going to create this content, we can actually have photographs. And so we can take stills from the video and we can share little snippets of the video. So it really was done more for that. And so when Spotify, I think, offered the option to have video podcasts, it was like, well, we might as well upload it, see what happens.
I agree. I mean, I'm 100% behind video now. And when I'm working with someone, I say, make a video like we're doing right now. So you have the video on YouTube. It's good for SEO. The video will live there forever. YouTube's completely different to podcasts, where podcasts are time-based. And so if you subscribe and follow, you only get a notification when a new episode is put out. Whereas with YouTube, you can have an episode that's been out for 2 years and then suddenly the algorithm picks it up. That's happened to me. And then suddenly this episode will start trending. So YouTube is much more SEO-based, search-based, algorithm-based, whereas podcasts are RSS feed-based. So they're completely different. So I am 100% behind video. My point there is it's just quite difficult. Yeah. So let's get into your episode. So I love this. All started from my very first point that I love that you have it on Spotify. I thought that there's about a 3-second audio intro at the end, which made sense when you watched it. But when I was listening to it, I found it kind of a little bit jarring and quick. So there's just like a 3-second almost, not a jingle, just like an audio, like similar to like the Netflix. Yeah, you wouldn't see the swoosh if you were listening. Mm. And so, because I first of all pressed play without watching, and there was just this noise, which was a little bit high pitched. I didn't really know what it was. And then you immediately started talking. So it wasn't like intro music. I get it, because like Netflix is the same thing. You put on Netflix and it's like, dum, and you know right away it's Netflix. Companies pay millions of dollars for just that 2-second like noise. So I understood it, but listening to it, I found it a bit kind of like, whoa, what was that? So I had to go back and watch it. And then I watched it and I saw the swoosh, like you said, and I was like, oh, it's like the intro noise. So again, it's that kind of difference between video and audio, which, it's difficult to balance the two of those.
It's interesting because the guy who does the editing is actually a video guy. And so he suddenly introduced, I didn't know that was there. I actually discovered it when I was reviewing some of the podcasts, knowing you were going to review our podcast. It's like, where did that come from? And so obviously it just shows he's a video guy, right? And so for him visually, it made sense. But you're absolutely right from an audio perspective. I haven't heard it, but I suspect it would be quite off-putting.
Go back and listen to it with just audio and you'll see what I mean. That's interesting you say he's a video guy. Sometimes I can tell when a podcast is made by a radio guy, because radio and podcasting are two different mediums. And sometimes I listen to a podcast and I'm like, this is made by a radio producer. Like, this is amazing radio. Today in this episode, it's like voiceovers and jingles and all the stuff you'd hear on a radio show, which is nothing wrong with that. And I'm like, it's just a different medium.
Nice.
So let's get into the beginning bit. So I went through this quite a few times. So it was great that you introduced who you are. You said your name. You're like, I'm Debra Chantry-Taylor. But I would spend just a little bit more time explaining who you are and why you are the person that's going to guide the listener through this episode. Because I always imagine I'm talking to a listener for the first time. You want your audience to be growing all the time, always new listeners. And in the beginning, I always used to think I was talking to your regular listeners, the ones who come back again and again and again. But I've changed that over the years to thinking about growth and thinking about the new listener who's there for the first time. They have no idea who you are. And it comes back to that, I can't remember the name of it, but it's all about the hero is your listener and you are the guide to guide them through. You're the Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're the Yoda. You're the one that's there to help them through that journey. And so just that quick one sentence to tell them who you are, which I did in my introduction for you today. And then I would also add what the overall show is about. So again, just 1 or 2 sentences. The show is about EOS implementation, blah, blah, blah. And then what value they're going to get from this particular episode. And then introduce the guest and how they will help you deliver that value.
So does that mean that, are you recording it, live before you bring the guest on, or do you generally record it after the episode has been recorded?
It's completely up to you. So, for example, with this episode that we're recording right now, I did it live with you. I might change my mind in post-production and say, no, I didn't like that. I'm going to scrap that and I'm going to re-record it, and then we can add that in. I did an episode 2 days ago where I actually pre-recorded the introduction before I even interviewed the guest. And then I said to him, hey, I've already done the introduction. This is what I said. Let's just get started. And we got right into it. So it's completely up to you. It's a great question. You can change your mind after if you want. So it's about kind of writing that down. And afterwards, I'll share my template with you. I have a template for introductions. And I do think the introduction is probably the most important part of your podcast because it's what you need to keep the listener listening. And if you don't do the introduction like that, they might just turn off. When I heard your introduction and I went back, I listened to it quite a lot. I thought it was a lovely introduction of the guest. You know, my guest today, she's a friend and colleague. But how does that benefit the listener? So it could just be a small change. Like my guest today, she's my friend and colleague who has done X, Y, and Z, which relates to the value of that episode. What's her background? How is she the guide? How is she going to help the listener gain something from this episode? So biggest recommendation is to introduce the guest experience and the qualities in just 3 bullet points and then introduce their name. And this is something I learned. I share it with everyone from talk show hosts in America. So I saw a YouTube video about this years ago and I've never been able to find it again, about how talk show hosts in America and around the world introduce their guests. And the best example was, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel, yeah. Jimmy Fallon, actually, I always get them confused. Jimmy Fallon was introducing his guests and he said, my guest today, he's just done a sold out tour around America. He has the #1 show on Netflix and he's just entered the Guinness Book of Records. My guest today is Dave Chappelle. And then Dave Chappelle walks out. And so when I started doing that technique and using that on my show, because you've probably heard it as well. I've heard people do introductions where they literally read out their CV almost. They spend about 5 minutes doing an introduction of the person, tells you everything they've ever done in their life, and you're completely bored and switched off already. So that's partly why the introduction is so important. So when I started doing that style of introduction with my guest, going 1, 2, 3, my guest today is, the response from the guests was incredible. Nearly every single guest would be flabbergasted and go, that's the best introduction I've ever had. That was amazing. I feel so good now. And I would often have to cut that part out because I didn't want that reaction in the podcast. I just wanted to get straight into it. And so again, that's what I thought was missing. Well, you could add for future guests is build up that excitement, give the 3 things that they've achieved, how they're going to help with the value of the episode, how they're going to help the listener achieve that, and then bang, get into the episode.
Nice.
So that's my biggest advice on the introduction, which I do think is really crucial. A couple other points in getting into the audio. So your guest, as you mentioned, she was outside, which was beautiful if you were watching the video, but I could see it was windy because this is quite good sometimes when I do an audit and there is video because I can actually look at it. So once, like I mentioned with the microphone, there was a problem with our audio quality, and then I could see in the video, and I was like, your microphone is way over to the side, like bring it in front of you. So on this occasion, I could see that it was windy and I could hear that it was a bit windy. I know from being on your podcast, I will not be on it yet, but I'm going to be on it. I know that you send out an amazing prep form and you have an unbelievable system for guests coming on. I can't remember exactly the wording that's in there. But I would try and get my guests to stay indoors and stay somewhere quiet. Just going to help with the quality. I had a guest one time. Well, I had it a couple of times. One time, I was like, what's that noise? Because it was like this. And he's like, oh, I have the fan on. And literally you could hear the fan oscillating, like blowing into the microphone. I was like, oh, can you turn the fan off? And then the other time I could hear this. And I was like, she's like, oh, my cleaner is here sweeping. And I was like, oh, can you please ask your cleaner to stop sweeping while we do this? So sometimes these are just normal things that you come across when you're doing podcasts. I would generally ask your guests to stay inside and stay somewhere quiet. It was good. I did see that she had a pair of like kind of headphones on with a small microphone attached. So the sound quality was actually really good. But the problem is, and I've had this even in the studio, she was talking with her hands a lot and she was moving, which was great, but she kept touching the microphone and kind of moving it. So you could hear the microphone rubbing on her clothes almost. So it was like, and I've had it with the cable on my microphone where I've touched it a lot, or I had it recently where I was recording a podcast and I didn't realize that she was touching it the whole time. And so the whole episode, you could hear her touching the cord. So it's a common problem. And once you realize it, you're like, oh, So I would just maybe just watching out with the guest, maybe saying, if you notice that, being like, oh, can you move your microphone, or stop touching it. But I know if you're on Riverside, you'll have 2 tracks, right? So you're on Riverside, it has 2 audio tracks. So that's always amazing, because then you can mute one of the tracks. So at 2 minutes 40, I'm being really specific here, you go to speak, and then she continues on talking. So it's not a big deal, but if I was editing that, I would have deleted that little part out where you go to speak, because it was kind of a bit confusing as a listener, and just a little bit awkward that you went to jump in and then she kept talking. And if you just cut out, the listener would never notice that we'd cut out that little bit of you going to speak. So again, it's that crosstalk of 2 people at the same time. And then again, it was at 3:35. You asked her a question that she didn't answer. You jumped in with a question, and then she just continued on talking. I don't know if she didn't hear it, or she just already had in her own head what she wanted to say. And so it was just kind of awkward. So if it was me, I would have cut out your question and just continued to let her speak. And this is why I love editing. And you do have to always remember that the audience doesn't know what has been cut out. Mm-hmm. So we can cut out little bits here and there, and it will just lead to like a smoother podcast. And I'm really splitting hairs here, but this is what I would do. The other thing that I noticed was when she finished speaking, you often responded with something like, cool, excellent, brilliant, almost under your breath. And to be harsh, it did come across that you actually weren't really engaged with what she said, because you were just kind of like, I don't want to use the word dismissive, but a little bit dismissive of just like, cool, move on to the next point. And so you're not the only person to do this. One of the podcasts that I work with, he does the exact same thing. Like the guest finishes saying something and he'll just be like, right, and then just moves on to like the next point. So I will cut out his response. I'll cut out that right, because it is just a little bit like, not really been listening to what you've been saying. Let's move on to the next point. And again, with the magic of editing, if you just cut that tiny bit out, it doesn't make you sound like you're not really listening or you're not engaged. So it's just so small, but I personally would have just cut that bit out. Now, going back to what I said at the beginning about stating who you are, what the episode is about, who the guest is, I got 5 minutes into the episode and I knew a little bit about your guest, but at that point, I still had no idea what I was going to learn from her, why she was on the episode, and how she was going to help me learn something from the episode, because I didn't know what at 5 minutes, I still didn't know what the episode was about. You just said, oh, my friend and colleague is here. And then she explained what she did. But I was still kind of like, what is this all about? Like, I'm not really too sure. So it just made me realize, like at 5 minutes in, it's why that introduction is so important, because it sets up the rest of the episode, that the listener is like, I know exactly what's happening here right now and why I'm listening to this episode.
That makes sense. It makes perfect sense. I'd never really thought about it, because I think I always worry that I keep, it's those introductions that you talked about that feel like a whole CV. I've always hated those, and so I tried to make it a lot less like it, but it's become a little bit too much less like it. There's nothing in it for the guest to understand.
It's with podcasting, there's so much advice out there, and I've done it. And again, like I said, I'm just giving it advice that I've learned along the way. It is difficult because sometimes you're like, do I just jump right into the episode to get started right away so I hook the listener? I don't want to do a big, long introduction. And as I said, I'll share my template that I use that is just like quick. This is who I am. This is what I've done. This is what you're going to learn today. This is who the guest is. Bang, let's get started on the episode. And it does really make a massive, massive difference. Now, you mentioned one thing here. This is why I was asking about, is this for video or is it for audio? Because you mentioned to the guest at one time, oh, we can see that you're out by the ocean. But what about the listeners? They can't see that. And I think it can be really difficult. And we're doing it right now. We're doing a video. It can be difficult. It can be off-putting for the listener because they don't feel included then. If they're listening on audio and you're like, oh, I can see you're out by the ocean, they're like, oh, I can't see that. This isn't made for me. So I try and decide if you're making a video or a YouTube, or are you making audio? For me, I'm primarily making audio, not video. And so I'm not making this for people to see. And when I edit this, I'll probably go back and cut out all these references I'm making about that I can see you. Like if I make a reference about something I can see or something visual, I'll probably take it out afterwards or try my best not to mention it at all.
Fair point.
Now, I mentioned as well about having the 2 tracks, which is when I discovered that you can have 2 tracks and it's not all the audio on one track, which means you can't cut out the background noise. There was a couple of times where you talk over each other. And so I would just have cleaned that up. I would just have cut out one of the people talking, which is just, again, I mentioned before we even started recording to you that it's really natural for somebody talking to talk over each other. And I've mentioned it to you before, and now we've barely done it. There has been once or twice where we've done it, but we've barely done it. Like I can see that you're sitting there waiting patiently sometimes to talk, and hopefully I'm doing the same as well. And so when my editor goes to edit this, she's not going to have to cut out too much crosstalk, but it is completely normal. And so when I'm editing a podcast or have my editor doing it, we'll make sure to cut that out as much as we can, because it's just jarring when you listen to a podcast and suddenly there's 2 voices in your ear. And so to try and keep it as smooth and as seamless as possible, I would try my best to cut out any crosstalk like that.
No, it's good. And I think the fact that you briefed me beforehand, I am being very, very conscious of not doing it. I also know that in very early episodes, I'm a people person. I love conversation. I love being in front of people. And of course, when you're with them, you're doing the whole, And in my podcast, I listened to one of them. It's like, oh my goodness, shut up, Debra. All you're doing is going,
So for the listener, what I said to Debra before, and I say to everyone, and this has just come from experience and from mistakes, I did exactly what Debra just said. I remember one of the first recordings I did, and I went to listen to it, and I didn't have 2 tracks because I had a Blue Yeti Ice microphone which sat between me and the guest, so you couldn't cut out the other person. And I listened to it and I was like, oh my God, Neil, all you could hear was me the whole time going, I just hit my microphone there. I don't know if you can hear that. That's another thing that happens a lot. I talk with my hands and you hit the microphone, boom, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so it was me that was doing it, this in the background going, because you think you're engaging. What I said to Debra before the episode, and I say to everyone that I work with, is that's really normal in a natural conversation when you're down in the pub or when you're having a coffee to interact with the other person. But when you're on a podcast, it's really off-putting to hear that voice in the background. And so when I work with clients, when I edit, I always cut that out. And it's really amazing working with people because I'll coach them to do what I did with you. And that was partly why I did it with you, was to then talk about it later on and so you can see the difference when you're making the episode. And so there's one client I was working with, Mindset, Mood and Movement, where you start to be able to see sound when you edit so much. So, and I would be editing his podcast and you could just see in the background his guests, you could just see all the spikes where they're going, And, thankfully I can cut all that out because it's on 2 tracks, so it's not a problem. But through coaching him and then him coaching his guests, now when he sends me the audio, I can just see the guest. It's just a straight line because they don't say a thing. And it's going to be the same with us right now when I go to edit this. Because you're not doing it, it's going to be absolutely silent, which means less work in editing as well. So that's why the importance of having that conversation at the beginning. And now you've seen the benefit of it in real time.
Yep, absolutely.
But what was great about it, because there was minimal editing on it, like you said right in the beginning, they just kind of clean it up a little bit. There was no long, awkward pauses. I didn't notice a lot of filler words unless they were cut out. And if they had been cut out, I didn't notice that they'd been cut out, which is great. So there was no ums and uhs, and I don't think either of you did many of that at all. And if you did, I didn't notice it. So that just maybe comes down to you both being good speakers. Your guest was American. I have noticed Americans are great speakers. They don't really do that and they don't repeat words. I think Americans are just trained from birth to be great speakers. And then you're obviously a speaker as well, and you've got years of experience in that. So I think that came through. You could tell that. I like to think I'm a good speaker, and then I see the transcript of my episode and I'm like, oh my goodness, you said so many ums and uhs. And so we do it without even thinking, but it was great that you didn't have that.
Thank you. And no, they weren't edited out. We just didn't have them.
You just didn't have them. Great to hear. But I did notice at one point you got distracted by something. I think you reached for papers. way over, and then you just kept talking, so your sound dipped out because you're still talking over here. And were you shuffling papers? Is that what you reached for?
Possibly, yes.
You could hear something in the background. There was like a lot of noise in the background, which was either shuffling of papers or the wind on her microphone. I wasn't 100% sure, but at one point there was a lot of background noise, which was either one of those sounds. So again, just trying to eliminate that distracting noise. So either don't shuffle papers if it was shuffling papers, because you've got good microphones and they'll pick up everything, or it was the wind in the background, which again we talked about in the beginning, asking your guests not to be outside. So getting to the end of it, I didn't listen to the full thing. I skipped ahead to the end, and it was great that you give your listeners the opportunity to connect with your guest to the point where she read out her phone number, which nobody's going to write down probably. But this is something that can be really, really awkward. I recommend only having one call to action at the end of your episode. And that call to action should be to support you and your business, not the guest. The guest is already there to help you showcase your authority and your leadership. You've spent all the money on the equipment, on the editing to produce a 40-minute episode, not to promote the guest and their business. You're doing that to promote yourself, or you should be, in my mind anyway. So you've already given them 40 minutes or more of free airtime. You should definitely have a link in the show notes to their LinkedIn profile or something like that. So you're already giving them more than enough value. So I don't know what you've promised the guest, if you've said, oh, you can do this or you can do that. But for the future, I would never tell my guests that they're going to be able to actively promote their services. And one of the reasons for that was I heard a story of a podcaster. She had a guest on who, promoted their book, promoted their LinkedIn, their website, and they were in the same field as them, which is going to be similar for you. You're going to have lots of people, as you mentioned, in other EOS facilitators, EOS trainers. And if you let them promote their services, you're giving away your business to them. And the story I heard was a podcaster had a guest on, and then her listeners were contacting the host, asking for the details of the guest. And they did the same thing. So she was basically having to give away business to the guest. And it can be really awkward because you're giving the guest, you're like, oh, you can come on. And I've heard guests, he's promoting, I've coached some of my clients through where it's like they've had somebody on and promoted their book and their website or their funnel. It's like, oh, you can get a free consultation and things like this. And I'm like, you're giving away business. So it can be awkward and it can be difficult because you've asked the guest to come on. I just would make it not part of that prep or that pre-thing, and I just wouldn't ask the question. So like, where can listeners get in touch with you? Or you can just take control of it and be like, I'll put a link in the show notes to your LinkedIn. Thanks very much for coming on. And not letting them give out phone numbers and funnels and free consultations and things like this. So yeah, I would just make it all about you because you're putting in the time and the effort. So you want that call to action to be for you. And you do that at the end. And again, this comes down to a little bit of editing. When you do finish the episode, if you go back and listen to it, it just abruptly cuts to your outro. It's kind of like, all right, thanks, bye. And then it's bang. And it's like you're doing the outro. And it just needs maybe that 1 or 2 seconds of like a little transition to just transition into the outro. I did think your outro was amazing. And some of that script, you could take that and use that in the introduction like I used. I would take it and make it more conversational because your outro was like a little bit adsy, if you know what I mean. But it was an ad, so it was fine. So I wouldn't just copy and paste it into the beginning because you'd be hitting somebody with an ad right away, unless it's really clear that it is an ad. But I would take some of that language that you used in the outro and you could use that in the beginning just to introduce yourself in the episode, and it sets it up for that. I think because you'd already given your guest a call to action at the end, I think most listeners will have shut off at that point and might not even get to your call to action at the end. And I think that's why it's really important to not give that opportunity to your guests. You want to make sure you use that for yourself. But overall, it's a great episode. I came across your podcast because you were interviewing an old friend of mine, Kat, and I found that episode really interesting, and that's how I got in touch with you. There was so much good advice in there, or some of the things that I'm doing. I was listening to that podcast, and I was like, yes, I'm doing that. Okay, I'm on the right track. So it's just about giving value to your listeners, which I thought with the first episode I listened to, I got so much value out of it. But I hope some of that will help. if you do take any of these changes on, I'd love to get your feedback on have they helped? Has it made a difference? How's that impacted on your podcast and your business? But overall, I love the episode.
Thank you very much. That's really, really helpful information. I have just got one question for you, and that is around the intro. Some people do have kind of pre-recorded intros. I guess that takes away from the more conversational style, doesn't it, and the ability to introduce a guest, or how do you feel about that? I mean, I hate it when you have adverts at the beginning, but what do you feel about the intro in terms of should it be the same every time? Should it be pre-recorded, or should it be very natural and fitting in with what the episode is about?
I would do it. If you are pre-recording it, do it different every time. It would be my advice, because I think it starts to become like radio if it's the same jingle every time someone turns on and it's like, you're listening to the Better Life, Better Business podcast. You know, like these kind of the same voiceover guy or the same style of voice. I don't know if it's the same guy, but it's like that style of jingle. So my favorite radio show in the world is from New Zealand, because I used to live in New Zealand, is the Matt and Jerry breakfast show on Radio Hauraki. And I listen to that every single day, still to this day. I listened to it when I lived in New Zealand, and I still listen to it when I live overseas. And what I noticed with radio is they do the same thing every day, and that just works for radio. They have this same segment every single day for 10 years, and I love it, and I can't wait for it. They have the same introduction. He says the same thing as soon as he starts the show, and I don't know how that works, but it just works for radio. They have the same stuff all the time, and I think that's why we love it. We love that familiarity. This is why I'm saying podcasting is a different medium. It's not the same as radio. So when people listen to it, we can use the same intro for a little while, but we should change it up. In terms of ads, I do use dynamic ads, and you can do something similar with yours. But what I do for the ads is promote my own services. So even I just recorded an ad just this week, and I actually just said to the listener, I said, hey, this is called a dynamic ad. So you're going to hear this on every podcast. If you've already heard this, skip ahead 3 minutes 30 and get to the start of the episode. Or if you don't want to listen to it, skip ahead 3 minutes 30 anyway. And then I did a kind of, it wasn't really an ad. It was more a bit of a story about 7 Million Bikes podcasts and how they can work with me if they want to. But so this is the beauty of independent podcasting. You can do whatever you want. One of the guys I follow is called the Podcasting Business School, Adam Shively, who's been a guest on the show. And he recommends getting testimonials as well, which I do now as well. And the start of the episode starts with a testimonial from a previous client. I think for you, that would be unbelievable. So if you could get a video or an audio testimonial, I can help you with how to craft that testimonial. I can give you a survey that they can fill in that will help create that testimonial. And if you're listening to this episode right now of Smarter Podcasting, you'll have heard that testimonial at the beginning. So all my episodes right now start with a testimonial from James Mastrioni from the Wrong Side of Hollywood podcast, who I helped with coaching, and he did a testimonial for me. And again, I'm just following what other people advise. So the Podcasting Business School advises start your podcast with a testimonial, but change it up every few weeks. You know, change the testimonial, change the ad, keep it interesting. So there's so much we can talk about. I'm excited that we're going to keep talking after this audit, and I'm going to be happy to help with any questions that you have.
That is so wonderful. Hey, look, thank you so much. It's been really, really helpful. I hope that the listeners have had as much value as I certainly have. I've taken at least 3 pages worth of notes here. So, yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for letting me listen to your podcast. And thank you for being a guest on Smarter Podcasting.
Thank you.
Cheers.